A month ago I was doing some research on a game called Makiak. You might have seen that video. While I was doing that, I stumbled across a game called Gala, or Gala. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I made myself a note to come back and maybe do some research and maybe do a video on that game. So I recently scanned my notes for an idea for this video and went over to Board Game Geek, as I usually do, to look up the game and find more information about the game Gala. The game that came up was a completely different game called Gala. Greetings, my friend. Welcome again back to my game room. You know, it's not really that unusual to find more than one game with the same name. There are a lot of them out there, actually. Games that maybe have been forgotten, and then the name is used over again, but in my research I see that. Well, this was that kind of a case. There are only so many sounds that the human vocal mechanism can make. I suppose you're inevitably going to repeat some of the same strings of syllables at some point. And it can be kind of a shocker when somebody says, hey, do you know how to play game A or game B? And you go, yeah, I know how to play that. And you sit down at the table and people start doing something completely different. That's not the way we play it at my house. But at the very least, it gives you an opportunity to learn something new. So let's learn something new. Now, the first version is called Gala or Gala, is also known as farmer's chess and sometimes called pagan chess. It apparently evolved in northern Germany and was played amongst the agricultural community there, and apparently dates all the way back to the Middle Ages. Farmer's chess has been mentioned by R.C. Bell in his famous book on games of all civilizations. It was mentioned by Jack Boderman in his big book of games. Peter Van Delft mentions it in his Games of the World, and Erwin Gloniger mentions it in his Das Spielbuch. So it seems to be pretty well known. Here's how it's played. The game is played on a board of 10 by 10 squares. The four corners of 4 by 4 squares are distinguished by a line, thus shaping a cross 2 lines wide. These lines are called deflection lines. Each player has 8 campas, pawns, 5 horsas, which are bishops, 5 cornas, which are rooks, and 2 galas, which are the kings. They are positioned thusly on the board at the start of the game. Galas move generally as kings in chess. Additionally, when a gala is on one of the 4 squares in the middle of the board, it may be moved in one move to any empty square on the board, with the exception of those squares that contain a piece in the opening setup. Kings can only capture when moving over a deflection line. A corna moves as a rook in chess when in the corner of the board, and as a bishop in the middle of the board. It is also possible to combine these moves in one turn. Cornas can only capture in moves where they move over a deflection line. Horsas are just the opposite or complement of the cornas, with an additional small difference in the capturing rules. They move as bishops in the corner parts and as rooks in the middle part. Again, it's possible to combine such moves. And horsas can only capture in moves where they pass the deflection line, but not when they move only one square in rook-wise fashion. Campas, the pawns, move diagonally towards the middle of the board until they are in the middle part, or in the opponent's corners. It is allowed to move 2 squares if the deflection line isn't passed with the first move of the campa. When the campa is in the middle part or in one of the opponent's corners, then they move 1 square in any direction. When a campa is moved back to a corner of the owning player, it can only move diagonally forward again. Campas can only capture in the move after they've crossed a deflection line. When a player threatens a gala of the opponent, he says, "Gala." The opponent must defend their gala if possible. Otherwise, The player takes the king of the opponent. The objective is to capture both Galas of your opponent. If only two kings of different players are left on the board, the game is considered a draw. It's not chess, obviously, but we've seen the word chess used for a lot of different board games. But I think if you're familiar with chess, it at least gives you a little bit of a head start. But keeping track of those directions of movement across those deflection lines, and when do you move this and when do you move back and so on, I think I'd need a cheat sheet. I think I would print out a 8.5 by 11 sheet that just shows these movements just to keep track of them, at least in the beginning of the learning curve. I did find one version of Farmer's Chess thanks to the Board Game Geek database that was produced commercially. It was published in Italy some time ago. But if you'd like to try playing it, you could very easily make up a 10 by 10 or grab a 10 by 10 checkerboard and delineate those areas on the board and just grab a couple of chess sets and go. But now the original game that I was going to talk about is called Gala. So this Gala is a game that's played on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. In fact, there's even two variants of the game there. In 1852, a Dutch linguist named Benjamin Frederick Mathis met Princess Kolik Pujier Arung Kanatoa. She was the daughter of the monarch of the Bugine kingdom called Ternate on the island of Celebes. Professor Mathis and the princess collaborated for many years on a dictionary that would translate between Dutch and Makasash, which is the language of the island. And among other publications, in 1859, the professor published a small book on the culture of the island, which included a description of the game Gala. According to H.C.R. Murray, Mathis described it as a type of backgammon, and he said it was played upon a board which also doubled as a race game of some kind. It's a little vague, but I did find a rule set, and it goes like this. This is a two-player game played on a board of 7 by 7 squares, with some of the squares marked as you see here. The game is asymmetrical. The black player gets 10 pieces, and the white player gets 13. The opening position is one black piece on the center square, and all the other pieces off the board. The game then proceeds with a placement phase. White places one piece anywhere on their own side of the board. Black does the same. And this goes on until all the pieces have been placed. And after that comes the movement phase. The pieces are moved turn by turn, one space orthogonally. The objective is to be the last player able to move a piece. I found these rules on the Ludi Portal website. All goes the same as described above, but in the movement phase, pieces can be captured by the custodial method. That is, when a piece is surrounded on two sides by one's opponent, the surrounded piece is captured and immediately removed from the game. In this case, black wins if it can block white from being able to move, but white wins if it's impossible for black to block them. I guess this is by agreement between the players, but I'm sure there's a specific number that would end the game in white's favor. I just don't know what it is. But wait, there's more. There's actually another variation that's played on a 5 by 5 board. It seems like it's going to be pretty darn crowded. I did not find a completely separate set of rules or if there's any other rules that come into effect because of that small board, but I had seen it mentioned in a couple of different places. Now, in addition to Mathis and Murray, a couple different sources mentioned a Swedish fellow named Walter Kaudern. He was on the island of Sulawesi somewhere between 1916 and 1921, and he brought back a lot of cultural information, wrote himself a 4-volume work talking about the culture of the islands. He covered it all, the zoology, the biology, the anthropology, the social structure of the island. It was quite a work, I guess. And he mentions the name of Gala, so I was eager to find out his take on it. Well, it turns out it's word for word what Matthias wrote, so I didn't learn a whole lot from that. But he did reach more people with the information. It's also been documented more recently by David Parlett in the Oxford History of Board Games. And so after I found all this information, I submitted that to our friends over at Board Game Geek to differentiate between the two games. Same name, different game. My earlier confusion has been relieved. I've learned a little bit about a couple of new games, and now it's time to get back to the gaming table. And you should do the same thing too, because you should be sure to play every day. Oh, Kalik Puji Rong Panema, Paniena.